This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers. Everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40.
Biology is our field, right? But we don't really have a concrete, unassailable way of defining whether something is or isn't alive.
In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Bull from the University of Oxford, whose research focuses on biodiversity, conservation biology, and how we value nature. We'll be discussing the challenges facing global biodiversity, the science behind conservation, and one of biology's most intriguing questions: what exactly is an organism, and why scientists still don't fully agree on the answer? Dr. Bull, welcome to the Higher Biology Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Really, it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm Joe Bull, and I'm a associate professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford. I've been born in England, born in the South, but I've moved around a lot over my life. I actually also am not a pure biologist. I actually studied physics for a while before returning to biology. So I've got a bit of a grounding across the natural sciences. And I've spent the last 20 years or so of my professional life kind of balancing science and work with industry, actually. So even though I do a lot of research, and that's my focus as a scientist at the university, I also spend a lot of my time working directly with large companies, trying to understand how to put some of the work we do, so the research we do, into practice. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, really.
And that's quite interesting. Historically, we've seen a lot of young people combining biology with chemistry for obvious reasons. But actually, more and more, you start to see young people picking biology and physics, and it's probably a really exciting combination of subjects to choose.
I think it is quite an exciting combination. And particularly, for example, where I come into all this is I think a lot about ecology, like macroecology, large ecosystems, and they're obviously very dynamic, complicated systems. And actually, having a ground in physics helps me try and model those as large, complicated and very dynamic systems. So there's a lot of overlap in that sense. And I think you're right. I think this combination of biology and physics is increasingly quite interesting.
Yeah. And what was your own favourite subject at school, Joe?
Well, I've got to say, as I say, I loved physics. That's why I went off to study it after school. And I just found it really fascinating because of some of the high concepts in physics, right? You're studying things from the extremely small, subatomic to the very, very large, thinking on the scale of suns, stars, planets, galaxies. And I just, the breadth of it really appealed to me. But also the fundamental nature of it, which I find really interesting. So I've always found the fundamental concepts in science really interesting, and I guess that's maybe one of the reasons why I was drawn to physics. In the end, it wasn't the path for me. I didn't become a physicist. I returned to biology, as I say. But that love for kind of the deep underlying concepts that underlie our scientific disciplines has always been something that I've been drawn to, and I'm sure we'll touch upon that a little bit later.
I guess the question then is, how do you go from being Joe in his high school physics class and biology class to then becoming Dr. Bull at Oxford University? Can you kind of walk us through that academic journey?
Delighted to, yeah. It certainly wasn't very much a planned journey. There were some meanders along the way. So having studied biology and other sciences at school, as I say, I went on to study physics, and I enjoyed physics, but it wasn't for me. And I realized very quickly that I wanted to move more into kind of environmental sciences with a biology focus. So I converted through a master's into environmental science and technology. And actually then I went off to spend a few years outside of science entirely. I went off to work with industry. And my idea was to work, in nature conservation, really. That's my kind of key focus. So I spent a few years working as, someone in industry, working on nature conservation. I got to a point where actually I decided I wasn't having enough adventure in my life. I want to spend more time traveling abroad to interesting places. And this opportunity came up to do a PhD, which meant traveling to spend a lot of time in the middle of the desert in Uzbekistan, in the middle of nowhere. So I had to spend a lot of time in a tent in the middle of nowhere. I had to try and learn some Russian so I could work with the expedition team, because that was the working language in Uzbekistan. And that really appealed to my kind of sense of adventure. So I went off to do that as a PhD for a few years. Again, not necessarily planning to become a scientist, but just pursuing my interests. And having done that, I then realized that actually science was really my true passion. Managed to land a postdoc. So having done the PhD, a postdoctoral research position at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Again, just enjoying the kind of the adventure and the travel aspect of things. And, you know, an academic career is hard, right? You can't always guarantee you're going to find that next position. There's a lot of competition for PhD positions, for postdoctoral positions, and then obviously for faculty positions, for professors in universities, there's a lot of competition. So I never really counted on that being the place I would end up, but I was just very lucky and managed to, things fell in place. So after my time in Denmark, you know, having left as a guy by himself, just finished a PhD, I came back with a wife and a child and, you know, a postdoctoral research position under my belt. I managed to find my first faculty academic position at the University of Kent, down in Canterbury. There's a great research centre there for conservation, DICE, the Durrell Institute, and had a great few years there. And then the opportunity came up to apply for a job in Oxford, and I took it because, you know, again, after 5 years at DICE, I was ready for a change. So here I'm now at Oxford. So as I say, not planned, but fortuitous, and a lot of adventure along the way.
Dr. Bill's journey shows how by following your own passions, it can lead you to work that matters far beyond the classroom. He is now helping to shape real-world solutions for biodiversity and climate change, which brings us to a key idea at the heart of his work and of higher biology too: conservation biology. So what exactly is it?
Well, conservation biology, you know, it's an interesting discipline because it kind of comes out historically of biology, mainly. So understanding how species work, you know, wildlife species, understanding how natural habitats function, understanding how ecosystems more generally function, and applying, you know, the idea simply that we want to preserve those things or restore those things. So it comes out of biology, but increasingly over the last, you know, decade or so, particularly, conservation biology has become much more about conservation science, right? And the distinction is that it's not just about biology. You know, to get nature conservation working effectively, you also have to consider things like the social sciences. You know, you need to understand people and their motivations and why they do what they do. And you need to incorporate that thinking and the research we obtain from social sciences, along with biological research, to understand how to conserve systems and to work with the people that live within those systems, right? Or use those systems. So the modern conservation biology is really conservation science, and it's quite an interdisciplinary set of disciplines working together. So biology is fundamental to it because at the end of the day, it's all about conserving wild nature or restoring or recovering wild nature. But it's not just about biology, it's about a combination of disciplines all working together.
And I guess more and more in today's world where we face these kind of big global challenges, that idea of interdisciplinary learning and interdisciplinary solutions is going to be so important, and something that maybe we should be opening up our minds to within education, possibly. Absolutely. And again, you know, speaking as someone working in this nature conservation science area, you know, clearly biology is fundamental. We need to understand how to restore a forest. We need to understand how to create a wetland. You know, these things require a deep understanding of the biology underpinning those things. We need to understand species dynamics, population dynamics. We need to know, you know, how we can bring back charismatic species that are on the brink of extinction, and how we can, you know, what kind of the underlying population dynamics are doing, so that we can understand how to recover them. But we also need to understand how systems function as complex, unpredictable systems. I mentioned earlier that I came in through physics, right? So we have physicists working in nature conservation science because physicists can do a lot of interesting stuff around modeling complex systems. We need people who can understand how to engage with, you know, we call them IPLCs, indigenous peoples and local communities, right? Much of the world's remnant wild biodiversity, remnant wild nature, is in lands that are owned or managed by, you know, indigenous groups, right? So it's not just a simple question then of bringing biology and physics to the table. We have to understand. We have people who have a deep understanding of very different perspectives, very different social perspectives on nature and what it means and how to conserve it and how to engage with a broad range of people. So that, again, that brings in the social sciences.
we need to understand economics and how that works, because, countries, at the level of countries, we need to understand how to implement policies, how to spend money in a way that conserves nature and restores it, alongside a load of other priorities too. So these are all a completely different set of disciplines that, allow us to, if we can bring them together, allow us to solve some of these pressing problems some of these pressing challenges we face, like biodiversity loss, like climate change. And the only way to do that is through having all these different disciplines working together.
So clearly, conservation biology requires inputs from experts across multiple disciplines to help us understand biodiversity, the threats it faces, and how we can protect it. Because biodiversity impacts all of us, it makes sense that protecting it takes a wide range of skills, perspectives, and expertise. In higher biology, students study the components of biodiversity and the threats to it. But at a time when many listeners may be thinking about their own academic and career journeys, it's also important to recognise just how diverse this area of biology really is, and why biodiversity loss should matter to us all.
First of all, biodiversity itself, why is it important? And I think there's lots of different ways you can explain that. I think it's quite easy to categorise it into, why is it important practically speaking, and why is it important to us on a human level, right? And from a practical point of view, if natural systems are more biodiverse, if there's more variety of life in them, they tend to be better functioning, right? Which means they do things like prevent flooding. They do things like draw down carbon from the atmosphere. They do things like provide pollination services for agriculture. All those things are things that come out of functioning ecosystems. And the evidence suggests that the more varied, the more diverse those systems are biologically, the better they function on the whole. So there's a very practical argument for why biodiversity is important. From a more human perspective, people care about nature, right? It's as simple as that. People value different components of nature, and people value a wide variety of different components of nature. So I think it's also, while we make the practical argument for why biodiversity is important, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that also people, simply for moral, ethical, cultural reasons, place a huge amount of value on nature, whether that's the local woodland they walk their dog in, or whether it's the endangered whale species out in the middle of the ocean they never actually see. People value these things. Now, why should young people care about it? Biodiversity has been declining for a long time, and it's declining dramatically, right? I mean, there's some really interesting examples, such as in invertebrates, insect species, right? And now the decline in insect species has been precipitous. We're living in an age where we're seeing a massive drop-off in the populations, the diversity, the abundances of insect species, right? And that is important because most animals are insects for a start, so we're losing most of the tree of life over time. But also, the function of a lot of ecosystems depends on those invertebrates. And that's something that today's young people are living through and will affect dramatically their future. This is something that's going to become more and more of an issue over the coming decades. So even, beyond any care that young people might have for biodiversity loss because they value biodiversity, because they value nature, there's a very practical argument that we're living in a time of ongoing decline, and it's a crisis that we need to find a way to avert.
Looking at our planet as a whole, what are the kind of biggest threats that worry you the most about biodiversity?
So the current threats to biodiversity are actually some of the classic threats that we've known about for some time, right? So particularly habitat loss. So converting natural habitats, natural woodlands, natural grasslands, natural wetlands, natural marshlands, whatever it might be, into other land uses. So converting them into agriculture, converting them to urbanized areas, whatever. The loss of that space for nature, but also the loss of those natural habitats is by far and away the biggest cause of ongoing loss of biodiversity. So I mentioned insects, for example. If the loss of the habitat that insects use, loss of the combination of plant species they rely on, is what's driving that loss, right? That's one of the main things. Now, another big classic driver of loss is over-harvesting. So when we collect wild species for consumption for some reason, if we harvest them at a quicker rate than they can regenerate, then that's what we mean by over-harvesting. So particularly, for example, fish, marine fish species. There's been famous collapses of different marine ecosystems because we fish too much, essentially, for example. So that's one example of that. So yeah, land use change, loss of natural habitat. overharvesting. Another big one is invasive species. So as humans, we have a bit of a habit of moving different species all over the planet. And a lot of the time, when we take something from where it's naturally occurring and put it somewhere where it's not naturally occurring, it then takes and starts to expand its population. And that creates a huge amount of problems for all the other local native species. And there are some extremely famous examples of this. Some of the really classic examples of invasive species being a problem are where you have islands. So island ecosystems are quite unique and often have a specific set of types of species, including, for example, bird species that have not grown up, have not evolved, I should say, with natural mammal predators. So when you introduce cats and rats and things like that to those islands, suddenly that creates a lot of problems for them. So, but there's plenty of examples where invasive species have caused the loss of lots of local species, native species. So those three are considered some of the big ongoing threats to biodiversity. Now, climate change is emerging as a major threat. Climate change is a thing we've known about for some time. We are seeing the world warming, and we're seeing the effects of that now. And we're increasingly having to think not about how we prevent climate change, but how we adapt to it in the world we live in today. Increasingly, that will be an issue for wild species as well. And in some cases, entire habitats. So, for example, one thing that I always think is quite profound and is not widely recognized by, I don't think, by the general public, is that some of the current targets we have for climate change essentially write off whole ecosystem types. So we're living in a world that's about, it's approaching 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial world, pre-industrial revolution. We think, by we, I mean science thinks, with a fairly high degree of confidence, that at 1.5 degrees, we expect to lose about 70 to 90% of all coral reefs. We're heading for 2 degrees over the coming, 2 degrees warming over the coming years. And if we hit that point, which again is that's our current international target, is to keep it to within 2 degrees, they think we'll lose 99% of coral reefs. So what we're saying is our current global policy is essentially to lose coral reefs. So, these things, climate change is going to become a bigger and bigger drive of loss over time.
Do you think that policy will change to take into account, or do you think that's almost kind of priced in at this point?
So we've been talking a lot about, crisis and disaster and negative impacts. I'm actually a perennial optimist. I'm really an optimist in my field. And I think we managed to solve a lot of these problems as humanity. I think humanity does a great job of solving some of these big challenges we face and has done over the years. Obviously, the problem with climate change is a lot of the impacts are baked in. So once you start, emitting too much of certain gases and you get this kind of global warming effect, it takes a while for you to see the impact of that. And as a result, some of the stuff we've done already will have impacts over time, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, which would kind of start to slow down climate change. I think we do have to, I don't think we need to be too dramatic about it necessarily. I don't think we need to be doom and gloom about it, but I think we need to be very clear-eyed and say, this is what we currently think is going to happen. We are heading towards that world where it's quite a different world. And we've already started to see it actually around us in our agricultural yields and in our temperatures and our rainfall patterns, in the flooding we get, in our heat waves. We're seeing that happening now. And we are heading towards a world where, for example, we don't really have coral reefs. I think there's not much we can. We're kind of a little bit limited in what we can do about that now. I think as the impacts of climate change become more and more clear, and the science becomes more and more well established, which it has been doing over recent decades, I think people will take more and more urgent action. So in that sense, I'm an optimist. But I think some of these things are essentially we're already committed to. So we are going to be living in a slightly different world over the coming years.
So climate change is obviously influencing biodiversity already. How do you go about studying those changes within your own work, Joe?
So there's a lot of classic thinking about climate change biology and about what that means. So climate change obviously itself is warming. It's changing the timing of natural events. It's increasing or decreasing rainfall. It's increasing the frequency of extreme events. So that's physically what it's doing to the system. In terms of what it does to biology, there are some classic things we think about. So one of the key things, for example, is the place that species live, their natural range is likely to change for a lot of species, right? So different wildlife species can handle a different range of temperatures and rainfall and so forth. And if it's changing where on the surface of the Earth you get that temperature and that rainfall, then the species will try and move to where to a new place that is more suitable to them. So one of the things we see is the movement of species across landscapes. Now, obviously, only some species can move more than others, right? So some species are very mobile. Some can fly, some can run long distances, and so they can move quite easily if there's space for them to do so. Other species, tree species, slow reproducing species, can't move as quickly. So what we're seeing, first of all, is species change their distribution over the surface of the Earth, and doing so at different rates. So that's one thing we study. Another thing is the phenology. By phenology, I mean the timing of different events. So, for example, species migrate at a certain point in time. And the reason they migrate is because they get an environmental trigger that tells them it's time to go, right? Often based on climate. So if you're getting different signals from the climate, then species might migrate at different times, or plants might flower at different times, or so forth. So these things are changing the timing of the point at which they happen during the year. So we study that as well. At what point do things move, or what points do things flower? Are those things coinciding? If a species migrates, it often does so to keep up with food resources, for example. So it's kind of migrating to a new area and timing that so that it arrives when there's a load of food for it to eat. Now, if the food it eats is also changing the timing of when it produces itself, then that means there could be a mismatch. So we're looking at the timing events and how that changes things. Movement, timing, and we often also look at interactions as well between different species. So one of the, as an ecologist, I study ecosystems and the interactions between different species. One of the things I'm interested in is whether climate changes the interactions that species have, or the nature of those interactions, or the strength of those interactions. So, for example, there have been really interesting studies into where you have predator-prey systems. So you have something eating something else. And because the climate is changing, you'd expect the prey species in a given situation to struggle, right? You'd expect them to start to decline, the population to go down, because they don't like the heat, or they don't like the extra rainfall, or whatever it might be. But then you find that actually the predator that eats them struggles much more. So relatively speaking, the predator finds it even harder to live in that environment as it's warming. So actually then the prey species does really well, because suddenly there's no predators to kind of eat them, and the population expands. So there's also this whole area of studying the interactions between species, and how that's modified by climate change. And often that can be the big thing that determines how well a species succeeds or doesn't succeed under a changing climate than the direct impact of a warming climate, for example.
Has there been a project that's really changed the way that you think about biodiversity and conservation?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Looking for a way to make biology unforgettable for your students? At Field Studies Council Millport on the Isle of Cumbrae, they bring biology to life through immersive curriculum-linked fieldwork. Their expert tutors, PVG cleared and first aid trained, guide learners through real scientific investigations, from sampling ecosystems to analysing data and completing full advanced hire project work. Everything's provided: risk-assessed field sites, residential accommodation, equipment and learning materials. With around 7 hours of tutor-led hands-on experience each day, students gain confidence, independence and a deeper understanding of biology in action. So why just learn biology when you can live it? Find out more about this trusted provider at www.field-studies-council.org/locations/Millport.
I think the projects that really changed the way I've thought have actually been about the kind of organizations I've worked with. As someone who started to develop an interest in nature conservation in my teens, quite early on, and started to work a little bit with some conservation NGOs, conservation charities, it wasn't something I had. I didn't have a course to study in conservation science. I was studying some biology, some other sciences, and basically just taking an interest in nature conservation. I think I had this idea that, well, you often think of, for example, as big industrial development projects as kind of part of the problem, right? New roads, big mines, all this kind of stuff. Clearly have a negative impact on biodiversity. They clear habitats. They just disrupt species movements. So you think of that as a part of the challenge. But then what's really changed my view, I think, a lot has over the years, more and more actually working in these different landscapes, and often working with not only conservationists but also with industrial actors as well, and realizing that they're, in lots of cases, they're just as keen to try and conserve nature as you are. At the end of the day, companies are made up of people, right? And people often care about nature. So I think one of the things that's really changed my perspective has been to realize that actually a lot of the time, big businesses, big industry, instead of being just a source of negative impacts on biodiversity, you're actually, clearly a part of the solution. So, for example, a lot of the work I did during my PhD and subsequently was in Uzbekistan, as I said. So you're working in a landscape there, which is very remote. There's been a lot of changes to the landscape over the years, not least that one of the big inland seas in that region has almost entirely dried up because of unrelated human activities. So you have a landscape where there's not many jobs. There's health is pretty bad for the people that live there. There's a lot of interesting wildlife. Again, it's quite remote and undisturbed in some ways. Lots of interesting wildlife. And you need some roads, and there's some mining activities there. So working with those projects, realizing that actually, as well as bringing employment to the region, some of those big companies genuinely are enthusiastic about supporting nature conservation efforts, and actually do quite a lot to support those nature conservation efforts in that region. So without them, you really would struggle. So I think, that's one of the big things I would say that I've learned and has changed the way I've thought about nature conservation over time, has been to realize that actually working with industry is a big part of the solution rather than part of the issue.
And are there examples within that work where there's been something really positive for biodiversity that's come out of a big industrial project?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting, we work with a couple of different projects where you've got a large remote area, and so mining is a big one, right? Because mining has very big negative impacts. But at the same time, if you have a mine in a remote area, it can be that they actually occupy quite a small area of the surface, but then they effectively protect a larger area because they're kind of preventing disturbance to a much wider area, and then they're investing money in nature conservation efforts as part of compensation for the negative impacts they're having. So they put in place quite large conservation efforts. Now, it doesn't always work, but you can have, say, a big mine that doesn't actually clear much habitat, but then invest a huge amount of money into a large new protected area to kind of mitigate the negative impacts they have with the actual mine itself. So you get kind of potentially positive outcomes then for some of the kind of charismatic species they're trying to protect.
And what would the sort of negatives and positives be in that sort of situation with a mine?
Well, you have your kind of direct impact. So obviously they're going to be clearing some natural habitat. And as I say, that's one of the big challenges for nature. You also might get them putting in new linear infrastructure. There might be new roads or something like that kind of cuts through natural habitats and prevents the movement of certain mobile species and that kind of thing. So a lot of it's around that. And then you have the indirect impacts, right? And the indirect impacts are where they're kind of bringing in people that then, need water, need food, need natural resources. They have a lot of impacts through their supply chains, because they're kind of using heavy technology, heavy machinery, lots of fuel, lots of energy. Those things all have an impact down the line. And one of the big issues with mining as well is water and the management of water, right? So they often use a lot of water as part of the processing of the stuff they're mining. And then they often end up creating these large industrial kind of ponds that often are quite toxic because of the stuff that's being used, and they have to be very carefully managed after they're kind of created. So there are a lot of quite serious negative impacts in those senses on regional biodiversity, but also wider through supply chains, but from biodiversity from something like a mining project. But again, if treated properly, these things can all be managed.
The higher biology course touches on ethical considerations in science. I guess there must be quite a bit of ethics coming into play then in conservation biology.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole subfield of conservation ethics, which touches on a lot of challenging things. So, for example, for many years, for decades or even hundreds of years, creating protected areas has been one of the cornerstones of contemporary conservation biology, right? It's creating large protected areas where you say essentially the nature in those areas is off limits. Now, obviously, that if there are people that have been using those areas for natural resources, whether that's harvesting timber or hunting certain animal species or whatever, or even just using the area to graze their livestock or whatever it might be, then there's a quite serious ethical dilemma there about how you allow people to use that area still whilst also protecting nature. And in the past, there have been some quite serious issues with conservation interests overriding local interests or even moving people off their lands and so forth. So that's one example of the kind of ethical dilemmas that have come up in the past around conservation. And it's not really a dilemma, I think. I think you need to respect the people who live in an area, as well as obviously the nature that lives there too. So there's a lot of ethical issues around that. I think in my specific area, I do a lot of work, as I say, with industry and with understanding the impacts big industrial projects have and how to kind of manage those impacts or prevent them or even, reverse them through some positive investment in nature. But there are a lot of ethical issues around that. A lot of people are concerned that by working with industry, you open up the possibility of greenwashing. So you open up the possibility of some companies to say, well, we're doing all this good stuff, so therefore we can go in and trash this natural habitat, when actually they're not doing anything, that even comes close to making up for the impacts they're having. So that's another big area of ethical concern with kind of contemporary conservation is if you're allowing people to impact nature for economic reasons, and they're making up for it through some kind of compensation, are you just essentially allowing greenwashing and you're still getting a loss of nature overall? But ethics, I've touched upon two issues there, protected areas and local rights and greenwashing and large companies. I mean, conservation is a value-driven field, right? It's about conserving nature for lots of reasons, but at the end of the day, it's a value-driven field of science. So there's a huge number of ethical considerations and ethical dilemmas that we touched upon with conservation science, and it's a subfield in its own right, as I say.
The greenwashing thing, are companies maybe being a bit more careful and not going down that road so much?
I think it's becoming less of a problem. Again, I'm an optimist. Some might say I'm naive, so I don't know what's true, but I think it's becoming less of a problem. And the reason for that is, first of all, that considerations about biodiversity have become much more mainstream in 20 years that I've been working in the field. So it was a lot more fringe when I started working in sustainability 20 years ago or more. But now it's become much more mainstream, which means people are much more aware of it as an issue. There's much more scrutiny of it. So if companies make claims about biodiversity, they're much more likely to be interrogated or kind of independently assessed. There's a lot more regulation. There's a lot more laws that say they have to do certain things. There's a lot more ability to monitor what they're doing. We have a lot more technology that allows us to do that. There's a lot more data. So I think it's harder to greenwash, and also there's a lot more independent interest in whether greenwash is happening or not. So there's a lot more scrutiny. And also, again, I think, people are, a lot of people care about nature. So whether they're working for a company or working for a conservation charity, people still care about nature, right? So the fact there's a lot greater public awareness about the state of biodiversity and what's happening to it means that people that work in those companies genuinely want to do some good stuff for nature as well. So I think there's less greenwashing over time for all those reasons. There is still greenwashing and we should be vigilant about it, but I think it's become less of a thing over time.
And global citizenship and sustainability would be key cross-curricular themes within certainly the education system in Scotland. What can you tell us about how your projects then are contributing towards some of those global efforts to I guess, address climate change and biodiversity, but within that kind of global citizenship context? Yeah,
so it is a big consideration for us. So in terms of the work we do, I often tend to work on these large projects where you've got some kind of impact on nature out in the field, and you're trying to understand how to prevent that loss or manage it somehow. And so that all of those projects now, whether by law or through kind of good practice policy, have some element of engagement with whoever's in the region, right? Like, in Uzbekistan, for example, there's a relatively low population density in the areas we work in, but there are people there. And they're kind of quite an interesting mixture of people from different, groups because of the nature of Uzbekistan. So, you have people that are Uzbeks, that are Kazakhs, that are local Karakalpaks. The area we work in is actually an autonomous region called Karakalpakstan. So you basically work with local experts in the flora and the fauna that you're studying, right? And they're part of the project teams that help survey the wildlife, that help design the mitigation measures to kind of prevent impacts on them and so forth. In other parts of the world, you then apply similar thinking to interact with, for example, indigenous groups, and that's less of an issue in the part of Central Asia that I work in. But for example, we have colleagues working in Australia. We've been involved in projects in Canada. And in other parts of the world where there are legitimate, indigenous groups who own or manage the land on which the projects take place. And again, they're kind of they have a key seat at the table when it comes to actually understanding the nature, the dynamics of the nature and the dynamics of the relevant ecosystems and what's valued and how to manage those impacts, or even whether to prevent them entirely. I'd also say that a lot of the work we do is governed by kind of global policy agreements on biodiversity. So that we have this the global biodiversity framework is something that was agreed in 2022 and sets out a load of targets for nature globally that basically almost all the governments in the world have agreed to, right? I mean, not all of them, but the vast majority. So the global biodiversity framework is what we use to govern a lot of what we do. And one of the things that's reflected in there is not only the rights of, as I say, IPLCs, indigenous people and local communities, but also the fact that they house a huge wealth of traditional ecological knowledge that we can, we should bring to bear on these projects, right? A lot of the time when you're working in these areas, it's not the people like me, scientists from Oxford, who have any idea about the full complexity of the local system. It's the people who actually live there, right? So they have to be a partner because they have the relevant knowledge to actually underpin the scientific research that then allows you to say, well, this is what's there and this is what we're disturbing and this is how we need to conserve it.
You hear a lot in the news at the moment about a world where borders have been closed down, people are becoming more insular, nationalistic. Do you worry that could have an effect, or are we sticking with the global or the ever optimist?
It does have an effect. It definitely has an effect. Politics has a huge effect on these things, right? Of course it does. So, for example, the last few years we've had big changes in the administration governing Brazil, right? And that has major effects on policy towards the Amazon forest in Brazil. Clearly, we've had political changes in the United States, which has had major impacts on, for example, funding for conservation activities in the States, but also globally. And, that is something we see in lots of parts of the world. We have it in the UK as well, right? I mean, so one of the things I work with in the UK and have done for many years is this regulation around biodiversity net gain, right? So we have a law that came into place, was actually put into law just in the last year or two, requiring almost all developments to demonstrate that there's a net gain in biodiversity as part of the development. So you're building houses or a new road or whatever it is you're doing. There's a whole structured methodology for working out how much habitat you're clearing and the quality of that habitat for nature and conservation value. And how you then make sure you get a gain in habitat overall as part of the project, right? That's in law. Now, obviously, that was a thing that arose through many years of one government being in control, and then we had a change of government, and obviously that's resulted in changed thinking about how to roll out that new regulation. So politics has an effect on conservation policy in terms of the way we see it, in terms of the way we govern it, in terms of the laws that are built, and so forth. So yes, changes in politics, and the example you give of an increasingly nationalistic world does have a big effect on conservation efforts. But what I always say about that is, the world we're living in right now does feel like it's taking a little bit of a step backwards overall in terms of biodiversity, climate change, and these issues. But I would put it in the context of the last 20, 30, 50 years, where I think the overall trend has been in the right direction. I think, these issues have become more mainstream, they've become better understood, and there's been a lot more efforts to kind of deal with them and tackle them, which I think is sensible. So I think the broad trend is in the right direction, even if politics occasionally, takes us one step backwards.
And you've obviously been involved in work using technology and data to support all these conservation efforts. How's the innovation changed the field of ecology and conservation that you're working in over the kind of last 20 years?
Oh, it's been huge. So a lot of the work I do is around, as I say, being out in the field, monitoring changes to ecosystems, looking for changes in habitats, changes in species activities, so forth, which requires technology, right? Now, it also requires expertise, and there's not really a replacement for having like a trained ecologist out in the field surveying stuff, right? But you can't do that all the time. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of travel, and it takes a lot of expertise in the specific place you're studying, right? So increasingly, we see technology as being a huge supporting role in understanding the state of nature and the trends in nature globally. So particularly, for example, I've got a project at the moment, which is with the European Space Agency. And satellites are a massive asset in terms of monitoring global change in natural systems, in terms of monitoring climate change, and increasingly in terms of monitoring biodiversity. And we've had satellites up for a long time, but a lot of the government agency satellites that are up there, and some private satellites too now, have been monitoring change in the state of nature for decades now. And those data sets are publicly available and can be used with the right expertise to really understand and basically survey the entire surface of the Earth. So that's one example of technology that's improved over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and is a huge asset to those, researchers trying to understand the global state of nature. That's not to mention all the other emerging technologies over recent years that have done all kinds of interesting things. It's now increasingly standard to use things like bioacoustic devices, devices that you put out into natural spaces to measure sound effectively. And you can use that to monitor different wild species or the complexity of an ecosystem based on the soundscape. Environmental DNA is one that's used widely now as well, where you're literally going out and finding free-floating strands of DNA in wetlands or in soil even or some other medium, and using that to reconstruct the ecosystem that and the species that are present there based on these free-floating strands of DNA. So we have a lot of different technologies that have emerged over the last few decades that allow us to monitor much more effectively and much more widely the state of nature. So yeah, technology is a huge supporting role for nature conservation.
And have you ever had any wow moments in your research?
So for me, I think I had a big wow moment when I realized that we don't really have a definition for what an organism is. Biology is our field, right? But we don't really have a concrete, unassailable way of defining whether something is or isn't alive, which is kind of interesting. So I think that was a wow moment for me.
You've probably just bamboozled higher biology students across the country by saying none of us actually know what a living thing is. Are you going to have a crack at defining it for us?
So I think normally it's defined somehow in relation to self-replication and evolution is one way. Another way it's defined is in relation to metabolism and maintaining low entropy. So there are a couple of the ways it's defined. There's also the third way, which is to list characteristics. So some of the biology students listening, I guess, might have heard that we can have a list of characteristics like reproduction, program, like all the, there's a whole set of things.
Mrs. Grain.
Mrs. Grain, exactly. But that's a list of characteristics, and it's not unique to living things necessarily. So that's not a definition as such, it's a list of characteristics. But what we don't have is an unassailable way of saying, this thing is a living organism. And so, for example, when something dies, what is the change that occurs? Or if we are trying to determine at what point life began on Earth, what was the first thing that could be considered as a living thing as opposed to a kind of an inanimate object, and what's the difference between the two? There are some border cases. I mean, viruses are one of the famous border cases, right? Do we treat viruses as living organisms or as not living organisms? Are they alive or not? And there's no way of categorically saying yes or no, they're alive. if we're searching for life on other planets. We don't actually have a way of saying, like, how do we know when we've actually found a thing that is an organism on another planet? What are the characteristics it has to exhibit to be considered an organism beyond all doubt? And that's actually, that's not a question we can really answer. So I think, that's why I say it's a wow moment for me, because obviously as a biologist, studying biology for years and then realizing that we don't actually have that agreed yet, that definition. I'm not going to try and, Paul, and give you an answer now to what I think a living organism is, because people have been trying to work it out since Aristotle and beyond, right? So it's not
maybe that should be your new goal.
I have written papers about it. I think there's a lot about uncertainty.
You've moved around quite a bit. You've ended up at Oxford. That seems like the sort of place where you could settle for a few years and figure out the definition of life itself.
Maybe I will try and do that. That's a good end goal for my career, is to try and come up with a definition of life. But I think it's a fascinating question that's not only technical and scientific, it's also deeply philosophical, right? So,
if there were students that are listening to this now and they wanted to work in conservation biology, even if we're not sure of what anything is anymore, what advice would you give them?
To work in conservation biology, I think I would say it's really important to follow your passions, because I think conservation biology doesn't require you to be one thing or another, right? I think that conservation science requires all the talents. So whether that's people who are lawyers, whether it's people who are philosophers, whether it's people who are biologists or chemists or, vets, we need people from all these different walks of life in conservation science. So for people who want to work in conservation science, there's no one route. There's just, people of different passions and with different technical skills can all be brought to bear. One thing I would say is that one of the things I've really found useful as someone working conservation science is that I've had some experience out in the field, out in the world. And I think, the kind of biology I do, as it should be abundantly clear from this discussion, is that I'm someone who spends a lot of time out in the field. I don't spend a lot of time, in the laboratory, for example. Laboratory is extremely important. Not saying it's not, but for someone working conservation science, I think it's useful to spend at least some time actually out there in the world, in natural systems, to get a bit of understanding, of what it's like out there, but also to inform, your thinking, not in terms of purely biology, but also in terms of other issues like people, like economy, like all these other things that actually influence real world conservation efforts.
And if you could go back, Joe, and give your teenage self sitting in your biology, or maybe it was your physics class, what would you say? What advice would you give to yourself?
I'm not sure I would change anything about my career, because it's been great. I've been really lucky and I've had a great time. So it's not like I would necessarily change anything. I think I'd probably just encourage myself to stick with it and see conservation as a valid career route. Because to be honest, studying, my biology class, studying my physics class at school, and deciding to go and do physics at university, I already had a really strong passion for environmental science and nature conservation, but it wasn't clear to me at that point that was ever something I could pursue from a career point of view. And I think we're in a different world now, how many years later. But I think what's worked for me has been following my passions and stuff that I'm interested in, and just doing the best I can with that. And that's what's led me to down the path I've gone down, and it's worked great. More importantly, it's fulfilling.
You've said already you are an optimist. We see a lot of doom and gloom on the news about all sorts of things nowadays, and for young people, I sometimes think that must be quite overwhelming when there's so much negativity. What are your kind of final thoughts and words about the future of biodiversity, the future of the planet, and ultimately our futures? Yeah,
there's a lot of doom and gloom. We have a lot of challenges to face as humanity, but what I always say is that, we solve problems. That's what humans do. We're very, very good at solving problems. That's why we've got to the stage we've got to. Whether they're technical problems, whether they're social problems, we solve them, and we will continue to solve them. And the only way to solve them, or one of the only ways to solve them, is to have, bright young people pursuing scientific careers, and not giving up on solutions. And I think, so we do solve problems. We have in the past. We'll continue to do so. And particularly in relation to these problems around nature and conservation, people really care. Most people care about at least something to do with nature. It might be hard to find in some cases, but it is an issue that most people care about to some extent. So I think the combination of the fact that we do solve problems and that most people to some extent care about nature means that I think we will find a way through this.
And hopefully at some point you'll be able to solve the definition of life itself for us all. And everything will be good.
If I don't, then if one of the listeners could, that would be great. I would love that.
Yeah, we should set that as a challenge, bit of homework for everyone. See if somebody can define it. Joe, thank you very much for doing that, for coming on, and for sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do with everyone. Thanks very much for coming on the Higher Biology podcast.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
We'll be back soon with more insights from leading experts, special themed episodes and short revision podcasts to support your revision. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, follow and subscribe on whatever platform you choose to get your podcasts so you never miss a new episode. And as always, a big thank you to our sponsors Lecky. If you're looking for outstanding revision guides and practice papers, head over to leckyscotland.co.uk and use the discount code LECKYPODCAST40. Before we wrap up, if you're a science teacher like me, then you've probably already heard of Timstar. They've been supporting science education for over 60 years, and they really get what we need in the classroom. They've got over 4,500 products, including robust BMS microscopes and Bluetooth sensors that actually connect. Great for practical, hands-on science lessons. And through Scotland Excel, you get exclusive discounts, free delivery on everything, even ADR chemicals, and they offer free demos and training as well. So head to timstar.co.uk or get in touch with Lucy Ann McCallum, your local contact here in Scotland, for advice or support.